Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm carrying out this video interview of Al Rush in my capacity as chair of the Secretariat Committee to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. I am also, however, the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which provides the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group. Al, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to have this conversation with me. As you know, we are recording it and we'll be placing the video recording that we're about to have onto the APPG's website, and we'll also be using social media and so on to draw attention to it. You're carrying out this conversation with me, Al, on the basis that you have already provided a written submission to the All-Party Parliamentary Group's call for evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. So let's go straight into question number one, please, Al. Could you just set out for me a little bit about yourself and explain how you, first of all, started to interact with the Financial Conduct Authority? Thank you, Al.
Thanks for inviting me, Andy. I'm very grateful. My name's Al Rush. I am an independent financial advisor. I've only been one for about 10 or 11 years or so, but for the past 5 years, I've been engaging with the Financial Conduct Authority, specifically relating to matters surrounding multiple mis-selling instances from the British Steel pension scheme.
Thank you. And what is your interest or connection with the FCA now?
It's not as much as it was 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. I have engagement with Sheldon Mills at the FCA and 1 or 2 other people in the chain of command there. But on a day-to-day basis, I don't have any engagement at all with the FCA.
Thank you very much, Al. And briefly describe the interactions you have had with the FCA in the past.
5 years ago, they started off email, phone calls. At that time, I didn't know who I should be dealing with. So there's a lot of phone calls, lots of emails to random people. Then we moved on to face-to-face meetings, moved on to discussions in and around Port Talbot, Palace of Westminster. We did quite a few meetings there, and we had a few meetings in the FCA headquarters at Stratford. Mainly now Zoom calls and emails.
Thank you, Al. And in broad terms, please tell us about those meetings. What have they been like?
I started, when we had the first meetings, I came away from them feeling relatively optimistic, feeling that we'd actually achieved something. And that perhaps was a false sense of optimism. And I think over time I grew cynical, and it felt like I was, I don't know, trying to paddle a canoe through porridge. We had the meetings, lots was said, we came away thinking, yeah, I think something's good to happen, but nothing good happened. We seemed to go round and round in circle all the time. There did not seem to be much genuine interest. There was lots of words, lots of rhetoric, lots of hyperbole, lots of sympathy for the plight of the steel workers. Andrew Bailey fell asleep in one meeting, famously. But we came away and nothing ever got done. It was as if there was inertia at the FCA. There was no dynamic aggression. It just seemed to be one big stodgy bureaucracy that we were dealing with. No matter how senior the individual, we never got anywhere.
And could you tell us, just to provide a bit of context, Al, what were those conversations about? What were the issues that you and others were trying to draw to the FCA's attention?
Specifically, mis-selling of the British Steel pension scheme. More generally, pension mis-selling from other schemes that cropped up on the radar. And I suppose secondly, where there were some really egregious instances of, I don't know, I'm loath to say criminal behaviour by some financial advisors, but some of it was pretty appalling. We would bring that to the attention of the regulator as well, where it was obvious that things were going seriously awry.
Thank you, Al. Have you ever witnessed any actions or conduct that, in your opinion or reasonable belief, breached any law or regulatory code or applicable law? If so, please tell us about that.
I can't say that I did. I've witnessed, or I've considered there have been many instances where the obligations and the responsibilities of the regulator and the Financial Services Compensation Scheme and FOS are not being met, but I have not seen any instances, in my layman's opinion, where any laws were broken.
Thank you, Al. On to the next question here. Al, have you had any experiences where dealing with the FCA has been actually helpful to yourself and or others?
There were some instances when the FCA responded to requests that were almost based on emergencies, where we knew things were going to happen, where we knew things were going to, I have to be careful what I say here, because I don't want to imply criminal activity was taking place, but we were aware of one or two things going on with some advisors that had to be dealt with very quickly, and they were dealt very quickly. But for the main, no, it was like practicing bleeding. If we put a point to the FCA, a big important point, then nothing ever seemed to get done.
Thank you. What are your thoughts, Al, on whether the FCA lacks the powers that it needs, or conversely that it doesn't make, excuse me, or conversely that it doesn't make a good use of the powers that it already has?
My thoughts on this have changed. Initially, I did think that they didn't have the powers. I now think that they do have the powers, but there is so much inertia, so much lack of direction within the FCA. There's so much navel gazing. So many people are intent on preserving their career or defending their fiefdom that nothing gets done. And we've seen instances of some advisors who have taken 2-3 years to be held to account. So I think the powers are there because manifestly things are happening, but they're not happening quickly enough, and they are not happening dynamically enough. I think it's an issue of leadership, Andy. It's not just management, it's leadership. They're two completely different things, and there isn't any leadership or focus at the FCA that I can see.
Thank you, Al. You've clearly touched on this already, Al, but have you experienced any difficulties or shortcomings in your interactions with the FCA? You've mentioned a few things. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to that?
No, I think I just look back on my overwhelming recollection, my overwhelming memory, if you like, is just feeling intensely frustrated and angry all the time. There was just no willingness to actually get up and get the problem sorted.
Have you experienced any reluctance by the FCA to give clear and straightforward answers to questions you've been asking?
Many times. Whether it's at a meeting face to face or on a Zoom, there is the culture is one of, I'm not going to say anything in case I'm held to account on it later. So you get a bland, anodyne, neutral response that's almost a statement reflecting policy. You don't actually get an answer on many occasions, and I think that's what I base my frustration on.
Thank you, that's very clear. You've mentioned culture. What is your perception of the culture of the FCA? What do you think about it?
I think you've got the wrong people there. I think there's a revolving door. I think you have too many people who've had a career at one of the big five, or in fund management, or in a bank, or the Bank of England, and they just flip around from one to the other. There needs to be a completely new ethos there. If you have an organisation that's supposed to be defending the consumer, then you really want to make sure that you've got people who have got absolutely laser-like focus on that. And I think in many ways you want people who have got absolutely no experience of financial services. That's what's required. If you wanted to split down the FCA or break it down into many departments, and one of those departments was consumer protection, then it's best to have people who have very little experience of financial services. Instead, people who are focused on protecting, preserving the interest of consumer. That's the culture. It just makes me so angry thinking about it sometimes.
Thank you, Al.
Andy, I'd almost forgotten until I read your questionnaire the other week. I'd almost forgotten how angry it used to make. I did.
I understand. Have you ever actually complained officially about the FCA in any way? If so, tell us about that.
No, I haven't.
Okay. Moving on to the next question. What do you think about the possibility of conflict of interest issues at the FCA?
Well, massive, because you've got people flip-flopping around, like I said previously, from the banking sector to the regulator, back to the big five, back to the pensions regulator possibly, back to fund management. It's a very incestuous, very circular relationship. There's not many people who are new coming into it. That's the problem.
Do you believe there should be spot checks by the FCA on regulated and or unregulated entities, perhaps similar to the sort of spot checks that the VAT inspectors do?
Absolutely, but it's not going to happen because they don't have the opportunity, the capability, or the intent. They just don't have the resource to do that. And they all say that's not our problem. But the problem is, it is their problem. It's nobody else's problem. If the FCA needs to have more resource to make sure that people are being protected, it's got to go to government, it's got to go to the Treasury to get it. And that's where it becomes a political battle. People at the FCA, I am absolutely certain, and it's the same at FSCS and FOS, do not want to rock the boat. They know which side their bread is buttered, and they will not go to the Treasury to get the resource to do those spot checks, which are so essential. Absolutely, they're essential, because we rely on Gabriel, garbage in, garbage out, and we know that there are far too few people at the regulator doing assessment of the returns that Gabriel provides. In the military, when you have lots of patrols out on the ground churning in data and intelligence, it's how that intelligence is assessed. And also, the people assessing intelligence are not listening to people out on the ground. I said at the time that if you were going to re-roll the FCA, you would re-roll it on the similar to how the FBI in America is done. You have regional offices where there are inspectors who understand their patches, who get out on the ground, who can drop in, who can keep their ear to the ground, who know what's going on. The FCA is stuck in Stratford. It's a blooming big ivory tower, and it doesn't get outside London. Well, that's the perception I think anyway. So that's a long-winded answer, but yep, they should be doing spot checks.
Thank you very much indeed, Al. And just for clarification, for those that may not be familiar with it, could you tell us a bit about Gabriel and its relationship with the FSA register?
Gabriel is the online reporting system that any regulated entity which is directly authorised has to periodically provide returns on their activities online to the FCA.
Thank you very much. And if you could change three things about the FCA, what would they be?
First thing I would do, I would break it down. I think at the moment we are just putting dry wallpaper onto a damp wall. And I think whatever you do to the FCA, however you try to reform it, is not going to happen. So I'd break it down. I would differentiate the functions, the secretariats within the regulator. I would make sure that the roles and responsibilities were far more tightly defined. And I think the third thing I would do, I would change the way that the personnel structure, the manning structure, call it what you will, is done. I think you have too many career people within the FCA who are unaccountable to the public. And I think that should be much more accountable, much more transparent. And I think the final thing, I would beef up the role of the Ombudsman, who can inspect, who can scrutinise the activities of the FCA.
Thank you, Al. What positives are there about the FCA that you'd like to talk about?
I'm not being flippant by being silent here. The FCA does lots of research, lots of thinking into how we should be interacting with our money. And I think that's a fantastic part of that. They do that really well. On the basis that my involvement with the FCA is limited, I can't think of many positives.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question then. The FCA is undertaking a transformation project, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Do you have anything to say about that?
I was going to use a rather vulgar comparison, but I'll go back to the one I referred to earlier. It's like putting dry wallpaper onto a damp wall. A lot of the transformation stuff is fine. It's window dressing, isn't it? It's just changing around with what people can see. The real issues surrounding the FCA are the structure, the corporate structure, how it's vertically integrated, the ethos, and the attitude, I suppose. So whatever the transformation policy is going to be, however it's rolled out and delivered, A, I don't think it's going to be effective. B, I think it's window dressing, and behind the scenes, things will just carry on as normal anyway. I just cannot see how it's going to make any difference. The problems that the FCA faces are huge. They're almost insurmountable. And window dressing will not change that.
Second to last question, are there any other comments that you would like to make?
If we were, put it this way, if we needed a financial services regulator and a compensation system, if we had a blank piece of paper, would we have what we've got right now? We wouldn't, would we? So the question is going to be, or my comment would be, what would that blank piece of paper look like a day or two after we'd started drawing diagrams and writing on it? And I think that what we would end up with would have very little resemblance to what we have at the moment.
Thank you, Al. The next question is an additional question. It's not one you're prepared for, and feel free to skip it if you wish, Al. Have you encountered any individuals or organisations, be they parliamentarians or other bodies, that, in your view, have really tried to do a good job in relation to the challenges that you've been talking about and the pension scam victims, etc., that you've been just talking about as well, Al?
Nick Smith MP, Blaenau Gwent in particular, is a star. He's a cracking constituency MP, and he really, really makes an effort. He really does. I remember one instance when we had a meeting with Andrew Bailey, and Andrew Bailey was banging his gums about something, and I was getting a bit het up. Nick just put his hand on my forearm, turned towards Andrew Bailey and said, "Andrew, I'm living in Dodge. You're the sheriff. Get your guns out." And that's his attitude. He's a great guy. Steve Kinnock as well has been very supportive. And I think, going back to the FCA, it's like financial advisors. Everybody thinks financial advisors are all bent crooks. We're not. Some of us try and do a good job. If a bridge falls down, we don't say your architect's crap. And the same goes for the FCA. I think within the FCA, there are many people who are diligent, conscientious, professional, who really care. They just don't have the means to get that out onto the ground to actually make things happen. So there are some people who I have dealt with at the FCA and parliamentarians who have impressed me immensely.
Al Rush, we'll bring things to a close on that note. So thank you very much indeed, Al, for taking time to talk to me today. As explained earlier, the video recording of this will be put onto the APPG's website along with your written submission. Mr. Al Rush, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Andy, thank you for having me. Thank you.